Thank you so much, Orunda, and congratulations to the History Congress under the leadership of Professor Bakchi, Irfan Habib, Shirin Musvi, and most of all, my colleague, Professor Mahalakshmi, for holding a kind of mini session at this year end, which for all of us, normally the year never ends without the History Congress. So she's helping it to us to conclude this year by holding this, and more specifically to her and the executive committee for inviting me to this very interesting webinar. As Orunda has already said, I am taking what I've called a walk with Gandhi and around the issues of religion, society, and secular practice. Um, it's very good that a lot of speakers have gone before me, so issues of definition of civilization and the broader meaning of this term have already been gone into, so I don't need to do that. I will just straight away take you back to that period of history, which those of you who know me associate with me, namely the 1940s and particularly the late 1940s. The end of a world war, the anticipation of victory in a hard fought anti imperialist struggle, a long jail term seemed hardly the time to dig for the roots of Indian civilization. And yet, that is precisely what Jawaharlal Nehru did. His book, Discovery of India, is a testament to that. If we turn to the undisputed leader of the freedom struggle, Mohandas Gandhi, the Mahatma, we find him engaged at this time in a very different kind of search for sources of tradition. There is no comparable tome written by him. Hind Swaraj is obsolete. His life, Gandhi said, is his text. It was a text which was played out in public, where even the most private self was out there for all to inspect. This life text that I propose to read with you today afternoon is his mission in Noakhali in the winter of 1946-47. But before we move to that distant corner of the subcontinent, let me ask a question which is perhaps in your mind and certainly is there in mine. Namely, how does Gandhi quite work through this complex interaction, or I should say intersection, of religion, religious practices, political practice and strategy, and secular being? My preliminary answer at this stage of the talk is that for him, the secular is rooted not in some French notion of laicite, separation of church from religion, but in a civilizational values of tolerance, acceptance of difference, and an urge to find common ground across the religious spectrum by drawing on key ideas and practices from different faiths. Indeed, in Gandhi's understanding, the secular is premised upon proudly owning one's religious identity, and this is something same in a person from contradiction. Hence, his creative interpretation of religion, a term that I use in preference to the term social reform, which drew inspiration from a civilizational ethos of mutual respect and tolerance between communities and groups. This, I would argue, became a far greater challenge to communalists of all hues than a perhaps simpler separation of religion from the political sphere would have. I hope that this would emerge in the course of this talk. But before I go ahead, Let me just dust off some cobwebs around the usual understanding of Gandhi on religion and politics. And by this I mean his being termed an anti secularist. Now, as we know, Gandhi's political practice is imbued with religious faith. He says this loud and clear many a time. I give you one quote where he says, I approach politics as everything else in a religious spirit. Truth is my religion, and ahimsa is the only way of its realization. But it needs to be noted that, for one, religion for him was not organized religion, but dharma. And I am so grateful to my colleague and classmate Kumkum Roy for having gone before me and talked about dharma in a huge degree of complexity. Secondly, and this is as important, when necessary, Gandhi takes a very clear secular position. That is secular with a capital S and in the Western sense of the term. Let me give you two short quotes. The first is his statement, religion is a personal matter which should have no place in politics. The other statement was close to independence when talking about the state which was going to come into being, he says, I can only say that this India is not the India of my dreams. In the India for whose fashioning I have worked all my life, every man enjoys equal status, whatever his religion is. The state, he says, is bound to be wholly secular. I go so far as to say, he continues, that no denominational educational institution in it should enjoy state patronage. Now, given this position, talk of religion in politics, and yet a kind of, as I said, a Western secular position too, how is it that terming Gandhi an anti secularist, originally done, as you would remember, by Ashish Nandi and T.N. Madan, it's surprising how this continues on the basis of that one oft quoted statement from Gandhiji, namely, if religion has nothing to do with politics, then I, for one, will have nothing to do with it. Coming to Gandhi's views on communities and nations and how religion is intertwined with this, he had made his position on this clear in the mid-20s itself, questioning the kind of distorted history writing that there was encouraged by colonial rulers, in which the past was presented as being ridden with conflict between Hindus and Muslims. Gandhi had clarified that his own understanding was, I quote, the two races lived at peace among themselves during Muslim rule. I think we can concede that Muslim rule a bit. An exchange with Jinnah in 1940. Now, this is very much after or in the wake of the Pakistan demand. The positions taken by these two principles were already clear. Jinnah said that for me, Islam and Hinduism are not religions in the strict sense of the word. I'm quoting him. Jinnah said, they are different and distinct social orders. And it is a dream, he continued, that the Hindus and the Muslims can ever evolve a common nationality. He went on to explain that Hindus and Muslims neither intermarry nor interdine, and that they belong to two different civilizations which are based mainly on conflicting ideas and conceptions. Counter to this was Gandhi's message that no, Muslims are not a separate nation. There may have been some Muslims who were foreigners to begin with many hundred years ago, but the bulk of Indian Muslims were converts. And he says this very clearly. I quote a sentence from 1940. He says, both Muslims and Christians are converts from Hinduism or are descendants of converts. They do not cease to belong to their provinces because of change of faith. In 1947, in the tumultuous month of June, when Pakistan was announced, he asserted this again in a different way. He said, religion is no test of nationality, but a personal matter between man and his God. In the sense of nationality, they are Indians first and Indians last, no matter what religion they profess. Very interesting words. Now, moving on to the religious roots or the religious context of Gandhi's political practice, I would just like to spend a few minutes taking up the example of fasting. Fasting, as you very well know, was a weapon in his political armory, which he used to very good effect against his political opponents. Seen by many scholars as being rooted in the Vaishnav Jain tradition, inspired perhaps by his mother's practice of fasting, especially during the Chaturmas, it would interest you to know, as it did interest me when I found this out, that by the 1940s, Gandhi is referring to fasting with or in Christian terminology, mostly with the phrase crucifixion of the flesh. Pyarelal at some point refers to it as the way of the cross. But let me quote Gandhi himself. Gandhi said, and I'm sure this will be very interesting. Gandhi said, fasting cannot be undertaken mechanically. One such act of perfect sacrifice would suffice for the whole world. Such is held to be Jesus' example. The idea is that you appropriate to yourself and assimilate the essence of his sacrifice, symbolically represented by the bread and wine of the Eucharist. A man who was completely innocent offered himself as a sacrifice for the good of others, including his enemies, and became the ransom of the world. He goes on talking about Jesus in this. He says, it was a perfect act. It is finished were the last words of Jesus, and we have the testimony of his 4 disciples as to its authenticity. In this period, Gandhi fasted many a time. He fasted in Calcutta in September 1947 to quell communal violence, where he explained this fast for the restoration of communal harmony by saying, God has at least given me to work and die for communal peace. And his last fast in Delhi in the month of January 1948, when he was elucidating on that fast, the phrase he used for this was, he said, I embarked on the fast in the name of truth, whose familiar name is God. It is important, I believe, to understand why Gandhi would refer to the Christian example of Jesus' crucifixion and not to Jain monks who fasted to death or broader Hindu beliefs which saw fasting as one of the ways to the realization of the self. The latter were perhaps rooted in the evolution of the individual, that is, a personal journey, whereas the sacrifice of Christ carried within it the redemption of the world. For Gandhi, too, fasting was a form of penance for wrongs committed mostly by others, but sometimes he felt by himself. He fasted not for personal amelioration, but for a moral transformation, a change of heart in others who were guilty of violence, intolerance, and worse. And yet, at another level, he always faulted himself and his own practice of ahimsa for whatever was going wrong in society. This connection between the personal and the public selves, the individual practice of ahimsa and its critical connection with the political and moral terrain of public life can be located within the Christian tradition that he so evocatively highlights. Moving to Noakhali, there are some slides here, um, which I'm not using them as a regular PowerPoint, but I will just request, um, you know, Prerna and whoever else is dealing with it to just show you. So I will go on talking. You can just take a look at these. You can just move them slowly, huh? As I said while I talk. Um, Moving to Noakhali, if there was one place which preoccupied Gandhi in the last year of his life, it was Noakhali. In 1946, it was a remote place in the farthest division of Chittagong in Bengal and difficult to access, especially after the rains. Hindu merchants and landlords who had made fortunes during the famine were the target of the resentment of Muslim peasants, which took the form of economic boycott of Hindus. But also targeted were the Namashudras. Gandhi spent 4 months in this area, from early November to early March, November 46 to early March 1947. One must remember one thing about the Noakhali upheavals. They were not merely riots. Noakhali presented to Gandhi a state of terror which had been assiduously fostered. Muslim communal groups were behind this. The leader was perhaps one Ghulam Hussain Sarwar, a peer turned politician who had given the call for jihad in Shahpur Bazar on 29 September, upon which looting, arson, killing, rapes, conversions, forced marriages became widespread. Writing 13 days after the beginning of the riot, the statesman talked about 120 villages in 4 thanas in Noakhali, covering a Hindu population of 90,000, and nearly 70 villages in Chandpur and Faridganj thanas in Tipura district, with Hindu population of over 40,000 who were besieged. Now, just as Bardoli was a site for Prayog, a laboratory where Gandhi fashioned civil disobedience, Noakhali was a karma bhumi. Do note the words, for the working of ahimsa in Hindu-Muslim relations. Elsewhere, he described his stay as a pilgrimage. In an ideal world, I would have walked down the paths that Gandhi traversed in Noakhali in those winter months of 1946-47. As it happened, I could only make a fairly short visit in 2019. Our first visit was to Sri Rampur, where Gandhi settled down in virtual isolation for 43 days. He likened his action to that of a wise gardener who tries to raise up one seedling properly instead of broadcasting seeds in the wind. Having nurtured one plant, the process could be multiplied everywhere. This is what he explained to N.K. Bose, the scholar who was his interpreter. Gandhi hoped that by putting up with as much inconvenience as possible, he would gain entry to the hearts of Muslims. So he denied himself any comfort, help, association except the minimum, sent away all his associates, took to sleeping in a hut. And interestingly, a hut whose walls were charred, they were burnt. In another instance, he held a prayer meeting in the charred, burnt precincts of a devastated house. It appears to me that he was resurrecting the very site of violence rather than erasing it or the memory associated with it. This is different from the usual choices made by survivors of riots, as has been discussed by Veena Das in the context of her reading of the anti-Sikh riots in 1984. The first person we met in Sri Rampur, the first stop, was Abul Kalam, 85 years old, bare chested, wearing a blue check lungi, Kalam recalled daily prayer meetings at which hymns from different religions were sung. Behind these multi faith prayer meetings, which Gandhi held, was Gandhi's understanding that, as he put it, I just quote a sentence: mutual forbearance and toleration is the lesson I have learned from the Quran, the Bible, the Zen Devasta, and the Gita. The main hymn that Kalam remembered was Raghupati Raghav Rajaram Patit Pavan Sitaram, an invocation to Rama. It was popularly known in those days in Noakhali as Ramdhum. This hymn, recalled by Abul Kalam after so many years, along with Ram Nam, namely the recitation of the name of Ram, were offered by Gandhi to the Hindus of Noakhali to overcome their fear. He had earlier helped, and with great success, as we know, his fellow countrymen to overcome their fear of the British. The challenge before him now in Noakhali was, would he be able to help remove the fear of the Hindus, their fear of quote unquote good neighbors, of unspeakable acts? The Hindus here were benumbed by fear when Gandhi and his followers reached. To quote Pyarelal, the faces of the victims were pinched and pale, and there was a scared, haunted animal look in their eyes. A woman came to Gandhiji's prayer meeting with a long bone of her murdered husband's body. Most Hindus had left their villages. Those who had stayed on had paid the price of conversion, marriage, forsaking of cultural identity, and most terrifying of all, silence. We can do no better than quote Pyarelal's account of Gandhi's visit to a deserted house, the site of killings. The school exercise books of a young boy who had been murdered were still open. Pyarelal writes, those that were not killed or did not run away were said to have been converted, including a deaf mute who by piteous signs showed the tuft of hair in a piece of cloth which had been removed from his head and to which he still clung. The gestures of this dumb boy were more expressive, perhaps, of the pain of conversion than any figures. Pyarelal wrote about Gandhi's visit to another village. I quote, Gandhiji stopped dead and stood in reverential silence for a few minutes as he came upon broken images lying scattered on the footpaths and among the ruins of the temple. More than anything else, it was, to use Gandhi's words, the cry of outraged womanhood which had beckoned him to Noakhali. The Hindu women here had faced conversion along with their men, but in addition, forced marriages. Many of these marriages were subsequently annulled on Gandhi's taking this up with the government of Bengal. Gandhi's answer to this assault on religious freedom was to uphold the right to practice one's religion, including adherence to visible symbols of faith. What strikes one was his acute sensitivity to religious identity and yet his remarkable freedom from bias or bitterness. Women who were afraid to wear sindhur or shankha bangles in public slowly overcame their fear, and we have instances now of Gandhi and his team being welcomed in the villages with arti and uludhwani, sound of welcome and festivity. Slowly temple bells were heard, as were the sounds of Hari Sankirtan. Coming to ahimsa and brahmacharya, Gandhi's practice of brahmacharya continues to, as you all know, invite comment, criticism, indeed condemnation even today. Books galore come out every year in all their prurient detail. Brahmacharya competes in voyeuristic sensationalism with that other non-event of this period, the alleged romance of Edwina and Jawaharlal, with equally no effect on politics. The choicest of hate speech directed at Gandhi in social media, if you would look, centers on this. Why then do I take up brahmacharya to discuss here? Because I find it to be an example of a creative reinterpretation of a traditional religious practice in order to orient it to a social purpose and a political end. Gandhi was convinced that the path to true ahimsa lay through Noakhali. He said, "It is to demonstrate the efficacy of that way that I have come here. If Noakhali is lost, India is lost." Hence came the idea of a yajna, a sacrifice. Interestingly, not merely an experiment, not a prayog, into which he was to toss his weary body. In a talk in the end of November 1946, before he sent off all his associates and settled down more or less on his own in Sri Rampur, Gandhi mused. He said, "Do I represent this ahimsa in my person? If I do, then deceit and hatred that poison the atmosphere should dissolve." The solitude in Sri Rampur made for introspection into the apparent failure of ahimsa to bring about communal harmony. What does Gandhi say? Gandhi explains. He says, "The reason for the present darkness lies within me. I find that ahimsa does not seem to answer in the matter of Hindu Muslim relations. Was it the weapon of the weak, as held by my critics?" Gandhi continued, "or was it truly the weapon of the strong?" The question arose when I had no ready made solution for the distemper of which Noakhali was such a glaring symptom. And so, explains Gandhi, I set out to Noakhali to find out where I stood. To quote him again, he said, "I know ahimsa is a perfect instrument. If it did not answer in my hands, the imperfection is in me." Please mark this. The imperfection is in me. My technique was at fault. I could not discover the error from a distance. Therefore, I came here trying to make the discovery. I must therefore keep myself in darkness till I see light. God only knows when it will come, unquote. All the while pondering on what he saw as the failure of ahimsa, Gandhiji was of the view that this failure further mirrored the imperfection in his practice of brahmacharya. That's where he brings it down to. And from there emerged the idea of testing whether his practice of brahmacharya was perfect or not by seeing if there were any vestiges of sexual desire which were left in him. For this, he shared his bed with his grandniece Manu. As was his wont, Gandhi lived out his life in full public gaze, including the latest test of brahmacharya, contrary to the advice of some of his close associates who urged him to refrain from making it public given the delicacy of the subject and the context in which he was placed in Noakhali. Gandhi waved this advice away, writing in the Harijan about it and speaking about it in his evening prayer meetings. Clearly, in his mind, there was nothing in it which warranted secrecy. In any case, there was no place for secrecy in his politics or in his life. Gandhi's brahmacharya, and this is the reinterpretation part, did not necessitate segregation of the sexes or abjuring the company of women, as was the case with some other practitioners. But there was more to it. Gandhi was not merely testing his practice of brahmacharya. He was trying to deploy the ultimate power of nonviolence to confront violence, to see how nonviolence could be spread widely to others. Gandhi said to his associates on this issue, I quote a sentence, he says, "A reformer cannot afford to wait till others are converted. He must take the lead and venture forth alone, even in the teeth of universal opposition. I want to test, enlarge, and revise the current definition of brahmacharya, by which you swear in light of my observation, study, and experience. So, to underline this last part again, he is testing, enlarging, revising the brahmacharya, which was seen as a traditional religious practice, and as I said, orienting it in a way which could have a significant social purpose for him. Another aspect that I would like to take up of Gandhi's practice in Noakhali is his Padyatra. After staying in Sri Rampur alone for 43 days, Gandhi sets off barefoot on a Padyatra of the villages, sleeping in a new village every night, in the hut of a poor villager, preferably a Muslim. His intention was to go among the Muslims unprotected, to live in their midst, and by showing his trust in them, help remove their distrust. Muslim villagers took to atoning for their actions by offering him hospitality. But he also faced hostility from Muslims. Doors were shut in his face, he was spat on, leaflets were distributed asking him to go to Bihar, where Muslims were the target of Hindu fury, and yet he persevered. Muslims of Noakhali often avoided his prayer meetings. Sometimes they would just stand outside the prayer ground and hear what he said. If he invited them in, they would even come in. On one occasion, some Muslims walked out when the Ramdhun was sung. On another occasion, they did not join in the singing. To Gandhi, this was a sign of intolerance, of a kind which was behind the October troubles. Describing his Padyatra as a pilgrimage, again note the word, Gandhi had vowed to go barefoot. But here he found the paths were often covered with briars and deliberately soiled with excreta and glass. Gandhiji cleaned the path himself, setting the example for local villagers who then took to cleaning the paths before he trod on them. Manu, his grandniece, wrote in her diary, "The soles of his feet were softer than our palms and were pierced by thorns and became cracked." Before he set out to a village, Akla Chalo Re, Tagore's song, followed by hymns and Ramdhun were sung. In Manu's words, this was to give him solace when he came across the sites of burnt houses and strewn bones. A favorite hymn was Vaishnav Jan to tene kahiye, Peed Parai Jane Re. And Gandhi asked Manu to substitute Christian Jan and Muslim Jan every time Vaishnav Jan was repeated in the song Vaishnav Jan to tene kahiye. However, not all Muslims were unrepentant or hostile. Gandhi was even able to fulfill his wish to stay in the house of a Muslim. This was an act of great courage on the part of his host. In Nandigram, the Muslims promised in future to defend the temple in the village destroyed recently. In Murem, the Maulvi in whose house Gandhi lived told local Muslims that Gandhi had come to free them of the stain of having shed Hindu blood. Hindus and Muslims here joined in singing Ramdhun. On another occasion, at a prayer meeting in Fatehpur, the tabla, the musical accompaniment to the Ramdhun, was discarded so as not to offend the Muslims, and Muslims, as a result, joined in the singing. The challenge before Gandhiji in Noakhali, other than the ones we have talked so far, was how do you stand up for the Hindus without fostering Hindu communalism? A task doubly difficult because the activities of the Hindu Mahasabha and associated organizations engaged in relief work push towards a polarization of the situation. One of the workers who brought money and sindoor for the women of Noakhali was, very interestingly, Vishnu Karkare, who was later on one of the conspirators in the Gandhi murder trial. Gandhi, as we have seen, was extremely sensitive to religious sensibilities and stood up for the right of the individual and community to practice one's faith. Yet, he does not pander to their self perception of being helpless victims who must build protective walls around their community in order to survive. He opposed the sensibility of victimhood and stood against ghettoization. A very important lesson for us today. His mission of peace helped the Hindus from falling prey to Hindu communal groups who were keen to exploit the situation. The wider import of his political action was that it was possible to work amidst the Hindu minority without playing minoritarian communal politics. In this approach, minority and majority became demographic categories only. They were not linked to permanent identities of majority and minority, or indeed to politics, majoritarian or minoritarian. If Gandhi answered Jinnah on the issue of separate nations, then the way he talked about the India as a homeland was a far cry from the Punya Bhumi and Pitra Bhumi of Savarkar's tract Hindutva. Speaking right after the announcement of Pakistan, Gandhi said, as a matter of fact, India is the homeland of all who are born and bred in India. Will the Muslim homeland live in isolation? He asked. Is not the Punjab as much the homeland of the Hindus, the Sikhs, the Christians, the Jews, and the Parsis who are of the Punjab? His Hinduism, one could say, stood out in contradistinction to the harnessing of Hinduism to communal politics by other political players, namely the Hindu Mahasabha and associated political groups. On the 20th of January 1948, some of you might remember, there was an abortive bomb attack at Birla House. And Gandhi's comment on this and on the young man behind it is worth noting. Gandhi said, he probably looked upon me as an enemy of Hinduism. After all, has not the Gita said that whenever there is an evil minded person damaging religion, God sends someone to put an end to his life? And then, going on, he ends this statement by saying, this youth, this misguided youth, should realize that what he has done is wrong. And he concludes by saying, Hinduism can be saved only by my method. Many years earlier, also, he had spoken out in this way about himself as a Hindu. And I just quote one sentence from here, where he had said in 1927, he says, there is at least one, he describes himself, I quote, he said, there is at least one man who has tried to carry out the precept of Hinduism to the letter. Very interesting. Now, of course, elsewhere, he explains that his Hinduism includes all religions, and it's a wide faith, it's a very broad faith. Now, the contrast that I'm trying to make here between the kind of Hinduism which is pushed by the Hindu communalists and the kind of very broad-minded Hinduism which Gandhi espouses, I think comes out most of all in that the speech which Nathuram Godse makes at his murder trial, where he says that if Hindus were not to be at the mercy of Muslims, then Gandhi had to be removed from the world. So he saw himself as that person sent out to save the world from Gandhi, what what Gandhi has had referred to. It is certainly ironic that the assassination of Gandhi, who has been described as the greatest living Hindu, should be at the hands of a Hindu who was keen to restore glory to Hinduism in free India. In conclusion, then, could we say that Gandhi's secularism was in a religious mode? After all, that is what he had said to the widows of Noakhali: have the courage to assert your faith. This, however, thinking about 1984 in Delhi, this was the anti-Sikh riots in which I had worked with an NGO which was engaged in relief work in Sultanpuri. When I read about Gandhi in Noakhali, what came to my mind is, um, would Gandhi have advised this, or would a secularist have advised this um, in 1984 in Sultanpuri? And what I'm thinking of are examples of uh, Sikh men cutting off their hair to escape recognition and subsequent death. And the thought that was in my mind was that I doubt if even the doubtiest of secularists, and there were many there, would have suggested to the Sikh men that they should have the courage to keep long hair and wear turbans, the symbols of their faith. In fact, I would say that a certain kind of secularist would be quite horrified at what I'm calling Gandhi's choice of a religious way out of a communal conflict. Ordinarily, the healers of communal grift go about their task by stressing common points of reference of the two communities or universal elements in all religions. Syncretic religious traditions, bhakti, Sufi, get invoked in the belief that sharp definition of boundaries between religions underlie communal trouble. In the aftermath of the riots following the Babri Masjid demolition, I recall a citizens committee being set up in Okhla in Delhi, of which Professor Thapar was also a part, among many others. And one of the things which this committee did was to organize an Eid Milan and later a Holy Milan as some of the activities which would bring the Hindu and Muslim residents of the area together. Now, Gandhi's way was clearly different. Gandhi's secularism was nourished by his faith. Its roots went deep down to its universalist and humanist well. And for Gandhi, religion was constitutive of secularism. And in fact, that yields many an insight to us, I would suggest. And what it puts before us is the need for a positive creative relationship between religion and secularism, especially in the context of the struggle against communalism. I think Gandhi has a lot to suggest to us today, particularly when I was writing parts of this essay on Gandhi. This was in the aftermath of the Bhumi Pujan of the Ram temple at Ayodhya. And there were articles in the newspapers, some of you might recall, which kind of sparked off almost a debate on secularism, with the Mahatma being invoked from all sides and positions being taken in favor of a religious language of secularism, as well as against religion having any place in the public sphere. And Yogendra Yadav took the line that secularism has been defeated because it doesn't speak the language of our religions. Whereas Pratap Bhanu Mehta took, though interestingly, he began his piece by calling himself a devotee of Rama, He then, when he refers to whom he calls the last genuine devotee of Ram in modern India, Gandhi, then Mehta says very clearly that we cannot have the politicized public sphere taking religious seriously. So, what's interesting for me is, and I end here, what's interesting is that Gandhi's message from Noakhali would fall into both the self critical secularist argument about speaking the language of religion and speaking in the vernacular, and but it would also fall within that formulation, the other formulation, which is about um, religious freedom for all and letting each person discover the law of their own being. And this is what I think is absolutely, to my mind, wonderful about Gandhi, that he doesn't give you any clear answers. You may go looking to him. He had no specific model of communal harmony which we can pick up and adopt. But I do believe that journeying with him, whether in Noakhali as I did today or elsewhere, allows us to observe closely how he goes about his task, unafraid, attentive to the strengths and weaknesses of his people, with his unsteady feet on the single bamboo bridge, which was so typical of Noakhali, but always with a firm grip on the reality. Gandhi offers no easy answers, but by following him, by walking with him, one may find one's own way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sucheta, for a very fascinating account of the 1940s, your special working with Gandhi. I think that this work is both scholarly, based on your detailed research of that period, as well as very much thought-provoking. And the two questions that you have raised regarding Gandhi's view on religion and regarding how to solve an, an existing problem, communal problem, at that, and in the sight of the trouble. So these two questions are very important, and I have something to comment on these two positions. First of all, you have very interestingly stated that Gandhi's religious position was his own created inspiration for religion. And I would like to draw your attention to one very important fact, that everybody knows that Gandhi was a practicing Vaishnava. And once upon a time, some people actually asked him a question, that what was about the Tulsi Kontis, the Tulsi Konti that he usually wore during his earlier days. Then he said that I have not left my Tulsi Kontis have left me. It's a very, very interesting thing, that because of all the practices, sometimes he could not do, but his mind was with this. So this was actually the inspiration. But the more important question was this that you have made, that when Gandhi made that Padajatra in Noakhali, you stated that the main challenge to Gandhi was, how can you stand for Hindus without speaking for Hindu communalism? That was a very, very important question. And that question can be recreated even later on, your own experience in 1984 or in 1992 during that period. So this is a very, very important question. And I will slightly differ, but ultimately I will be in your favor, that when you say that Gandhi did not give any clear answer to this question, I will rather say that Gandhi probably gave a deeper answer to this question, which we could not understand. So that is my position. But then there may be other questions which Mahalakshmi will tell you,
Yes.
because this is a very fascinating account that you have made. And another point, I think I would support you, this working with Gandhi, that when we judge Gandhi, we should not go by his writings only, by his deeds. That is Gandhi's own statement. Even on his writings, he said that if there is a difference between his earlier and later writings, follow the later writings. That was his position. And so this working with Gandhi is actually following Gandhi in his deeds, not only his writings. So that is very, very, I think, not only thought-provoking, but also paying, I will say, in historical research.
Very briefly, Maha, if I can just say something on the last part. But thank you, Arunda, always for very insightful comments. On this last thing, um, I think there is a point that you are making where I would go along with you about the text, about his life being his text, being his message, and about his saying that always take the last thing I have written. I don't, for me, consistency is not a virtue. And here I just wanted to say that as historians, we're a little better off than actually the greatest disservice had to Gandhi has been done by what are called the Gandhian philosophers, the philosophers, who write on what they call Gandhian philosophy. Because, that's what happens, there it becomes like tenets, no? So without understanding how it has developed, so it becomes like a list of tenets, which he has said something at different points, and they are put together like teachings or sayings. So, Gandhian philosophers and Gandhians also have done great disservice to him by straitjacketing him, you know. So, they also have gone by what he has said rather than what he did. So I think this point is very well taken. And about Hind Swaraj, I wanted to add that perhaps the to my mind the greatest problem is because we take Hind Swaraj as the quintessential Gandhian text everywhere, whether it is it is a very important document, but it came very early on. That's why I said at the beginning of my talk today that it is obsolete. By this time, it is obsolete. So, otherwise, I could have done a very easy talk on Gandhi and Indian civilization for today by looking at Hind Swaraj, because Gandhi has given a whole critique of Western civilization and built a whole picture of what the Indian village should be. But if I take that as Gandhi on Indian civilization, I would be making a terrible mistake, because that was not the sum total of what he said.
Thank you. May I, Professor Bandyopadhyay, with your permission, present the questions that have come up in the chat boxes. Bratati Hore has a very interesting question. The heartlessness of the state was manifested after December 1947, when, according to the agreement arrived at by both India and Pakistan, work started on the rescue and rehabilitation of abducted women. By then, a number of them had become spouses of their abductors, and some had even become mothers of their children. Some had not wanted to be rehabilitated, but the state had assumed the role of guardian of those women. What was Gandhi's role here, if any?
Well, obviously, you're mentioning a period of December 1947. I don't think there would be any scope for Gandhi having a role here. I have not come across any reference to this particular issue. But in general, he was this is not a problem specific, Bratati, to Bengal or to Noakhali. This was a very big problem on the western side also, on in Punjab, where many more women, they were in thousands, they all, I think together they came to, if you counted both the eastern and the western side, they were almost close to a lakh, I think. And this was a very big problem. Um, my own take on this is a little different from what Urvashi Butalia and Ritu Menon and Kamla Basin have written, where they see it as a patriarchal state which is imposing its views on these women. I think that's a little too simplistic. And because when we, from the oral histories, have seen the reactions of the natal families of these women, that is, their fathers, their mothers, their sisters, the brothers, there are many instances where they have wanted them back, wanted these girls back. However, in the popular cinema, I'm referring to Pinjar, and I'm referring to Khamosh Pani also. But somehow the impression, this is the impression now which is generally given, which is that the women had made peace in their marriages and therefore did not want to come back. As I said, if you look at range of oral histories, and also if you look at the creative writing, the fiction on partition, Jamila Hashmi, a very famous writer of Urdu, who wrote a very moving short story called The Exile, which was about such a Sikh woman who was abducted, had a child, had a daughter, doesn't come, but how she's, the dilemma that she faces. The word exile comes from, she sees herself as Sita, who is in exile, she is with Ravan. So, she hasn't made peace. She doesn't make inside somewhere. So what I'm saying is that this matter is a very complex matter. There are two sides to it. We cannot only see it as that the state imposed its views. After all, there were women like Mridula Sarabhai, Anis Kidwai, Kamla Ben Patel, Rameshwari Nehru, and other social workers who spearheaded this whole effort of rescue and rehabilitation. And not all were of the kind who trod ruthlessly over the wishes of the women. I think we need a lot more work at the ground level, to see the issue in a more complex way. I would just, I know I'm very, this thing of the time, conscious of the time, but if I'm permitted one sentence here, being a partition refugee, coming from a partition refugee family, one of my uncles went across as late as 10 years after the event to recover his sister, and who then came away with him, and she made a new life for herself in Delhi, and we never knew about her past or anything for 30-40 years till till that happened, till in the 1990s, when I was writing on partition, and a friend of mine, Swarna Iyer, came to do her research on partition of Punjab and was looking for people to interview. And then my mother talked about this. So there must be so many such stories which are out there waiting to be recorded. Thank you for the time you've given me.
Thank you so much for that. Is there time for one more question? The two people who are asking a similar question. One is Ashraf Ali. He says, is Gandhi's idea of Ramarajya to attract the majority of Hindus in India? Did the spread of the idea of Ramarajya bring distance between Indian Muslims and Gandhiji? And Virendra Dillon puts it in another way, and he says, is pluralism or Hindu ideal the essence of Gandhi's view of Indian civilization?
Well, the last question first. Certainly, pluralism is Gandhiji's ideal of Indian civilization. About the first question, I would beg to disagree. I think Ram Raj was just a name for utopia that Gandhiji used. There was no religious thing to it more than that. And also, do remember that in the villages of UP, the Muslim peasants knew the chopais from Tulsidas. They knew what Ram Raj meant. When they heard Ram Raj, they understood it to mean utopia. They did not, the Muslims did not understand it to mean a Hindu Raj at all. There was a big difference. However, this was Professor Salil Mishra is here. Maybe he can later come in on this at the end of the session. Not now, I mean later this time. That there is, of course, it was an issue which was taken up by the Muslim League for propaganda. They whipped up this idea that look at Gandhi, he says Ram Raj, that will mean Hindu Raj. That was the propaganda. But ordinary people did not, whether Hindu or Muslim, did not understand it in this way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, we're out of time. So I think we have other questions, but we'll keep them on hold. And maybe I'll pass them on to Professor Mahajan. And, she can have a discussion. We have the email IDs of these participants.
Or at 6 p.m. if you have time. Huh?